Hello again, everybody. I'm Eric Christopher, president of WSC Realty Advisors here in Long Beach. I've been an apartment owner, broker, and property manager for the last 15 years. And today we're going to drill down on apartment sales metrics. These sales metrics are very common. I'm sure many of you are very well versed in them. They're very easy to calculate. What we're going to do today is briefly just kind of drill down into some of these things and see if we can kind of read between the lines on something that's for sale or maybe that you're looking to buy, and maybe give you a little insight that you didn't have. So let's get started. The lowest common denominator of a sales metric on really any kind of commercial real estate is price per square foot. Price per square foot is very easy to calculate. It's simply the sale or listing price divided by the rentable square foot of the building. And the rentable square foot of the building is easily found on any title report. So let me go ahead and share my screen with you today. Just one slide, keeping it real simple. And we have here our two buildings. And these are actually just about 4 or 5 doors down from one another here in the central area of Long Beach. And we'll use these two to just kind of dissect these metrics and look at the nuances that are built inside of them. As you can see, the building on your left is an old 1920s vintage all studio building. It doesn't have any parking. We'll use that as one end of the bookend. And then on the right side, we have a 1980s built 3-story, all 2-bedroom, 2-bath with parking on the bottom floor. I'm sure if you drove around Long Beach, you see a lot of these. You actually see a lot of both of these driving around Long Beach. So we use these two. They're very similar in where they're located, but the metrics that we'll see can tell us a lot of different things about these properties. Let's start with cost per square foot, what we were just talking about. Notice on the building on the left that the cost per square foot is $101 per foot higher than the one on the right. So you might look at this thing and say, heck no, I'm not going to take a look at that building. The price per square foot is too high relative to the rest of the market. Now, there's a reason for that. It took me a while when I was younger in the career to notice that the smaller buildings have vastly higher cost per square foot than the larger buildings. And it took me a while to figure out, why is that? Well, it's really simple when you think about it. The studio unit that you'd see on the building on the left is generating a much higher per foot rent rate than the building on the right. For example, let's say the market rate on those studio units is around, say, $1,200 at this point, and those units are around 375 square feet. Right away, that's a rent rate that's above $3 a square foot. Now, if you go over to the building on the right, which is a 2-bedroom, 2-bath, let's say it's 850 or so square feet, you're going to get rent, market rate rent is about $1,750 on that. And that's going to be $1 less per square foot than the studio unit. So that translates into the sale price per foot being much higher. So the moral of this story is the price per square foot is only relevant on buildings of similar size and probably age. So you wouldn't want to try to compare cost per square foot on 2 different buildings as we're looking at here. But at the end of the day, the cost per square foot, again, is your lowest common denominator on the price. It can kind of cut through the fog or the gray area in what you're seeing based on a similar building, with different rents and different expenses. At the end of the day, we do find the cost per square foot usually kind of lines up into a pretty decent pattern. Now, let's really briefly touch on cost per unit. This is a lot more linear than the cost per square foot, meaning the building on the right would always have a higher cost per unit than the building on the left. Obviously, you have 2-bedroom, 2-bath. You're generating a lot more income overall from those units. Forget the square foot rental income, but just the total income per unit. So you would never see a cost per unit on the left building being higher than the right. It's much more linear and in direct relation to the total rent received rather than the rent received per square foot. Now let's get into a couple more here that have a little more moving parts in the math department. The gross rent multiplier is very easy to calculate. Sale price divided by the gross annual income of the building. Many investors are familiar with this, but let's take a look at the nuance within this one. Obviously, it's a top line revenue item only. You're talking nothing about expenses. It's all just about the incoming rent. Now, most buyers would say they want to buy at a low GRM. And I'm not here to dispute that, but what we see a lot of in the marketplace is buildings that are listed that have these sky high GRMs. Why is that? Well, the easiest answer is it's just overpriced. But the second part of that needs some analysis behind it is where are the rents? And I kind of gave the punchline away on this one where I put the rents next to the GRM. If you have a building that has under market rents, your GRM is going to register very high. So in this case, we would probably all agree that a studio building in central Long Beach right now would achieve $1,200 rent per month. Using this example, they're charging only $825. That's going to register a very high GRM that does not look good to the eye. We would all agree probably that that building is not a 17 times gross building. Let's flop that over to the other building. On this one, I purposely put the rents at a higher level, probably a little above market. You're probably $100 or so above market, but it shows a very attractive GRM, 13.5. Which building's better? Well, I can tell you one thing. If you were to take those rents on the left building, and let's say you could buy it where there may be 2 or 3 vacant units, you can put new tenants in there with the proper market rent, raise the other tenants up to the allowable around 6% with the rent control, what will happen to your GRM? Well, it'll come down. So you have the value add component that's going to shift your GRM level down to where you might have bought it at that 17 number. Looking at the right building, do you think there's upside in the 1850? I do not. So if you had a tenant move out of there, you're probably putting them back in at the same rental rate. So even though it's a lower GRM, you may have better upside in the high GRM offering. Let's move into the final one today, and it does have the most moving parts in it. So thus it can be maybe swayed a different direction from reality. That's cap rate. That's short for capitalization rate. And when I was first on in my career, it took me a little while to figure out cap rate's easy to calculate. It is simply your rate of return on a property if you paid cash for it. And this is a common denominator used across all income producing properties. The cap rate is communicated as a 2 decimal percentage. What it's doing is taking income less expenses, giving you your net income. And if you paid cash for the building, you have that money to spend. Now, there's quite a few nuances in here. So we sort of already covered the income side with the under market rents and the at market rents on the GRM. So let's assume we're putting together a model for your building you want to buy. And we've arrived at a number that we feel is the proper income number. Now, we've now got to accept what the expenses are. And that's left to a lot of gray area when you read the broker's packages and what you've experienced as a manager like I have, or what you've experienced as an owner over the years. So it's very, very important before you look at the cap rate on a broker's package and say, wow, it's a 6% cap rate. Maybe not so fast. Let's really dig into the percentages of what the expenses will mean. And once we derive that, we get our own net income. When you work with me on the buy side, we really, really lift the hood up and inspect the engine of that building as we're going through an escrow process to decide, are those numbers really true, or are they subject to something that they're not putting in there? Because far leave it for a broker to want to make the listing look better, right? But it's up to us when we're buying the building to really do a solid job of due diligence, arrive at what the net income is now and what it should be in, let's say, a year, if you raise the rents and do upgrades or whatever you're doing. And then can we do other things to lower expenses? Because the net income is what's driving your cap rate. So let's say, for example, we could put a RUBS utility reimbursement program in. Let's say there's a few empty storage units you could rent for $50 a month. Anything you can do to either reduce expenses or increase your income is going to make your cap rate look better. So again, looking at how people think about buying buildings, they look at it and say, wow, I want to buy a high cap rate. Well, is that cap rate just driven off of expenses that are too low and maybe even rents that are juiced up too high? Or is it a low cap rate building like the one on the left here? 3.63 is ridiculous. But if you did value add maneuvers on this building, your cap rate should be as good or better than the one on the right. So cap rate is very useful when it is derived correctly. So in closing, all of these metrics are affected more by the tide of the market going up or down, but can also be influenced by the operations of the building. Again, increasing rents, decreasing expenses, etc. At the end of the day, when you work with me as a buyer rep, I take a very, very strong look at the numbers that are being communicated. We reconcile those against what we think is our reality and come up with a price point that makes sense for you to buy the building. So I do that as part of my normal travel with a buyer. So if there's any questions about these sales metrics and maybe how they might affect you, if you're looking at a building right now that you're considering buying, but you say, wow, this doesn't seem quite in line, I encourage you to give me a call and we can talk about it and see what direction would be best for you. Thank you.